I suppose my story starts in a graveyard in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. If you go to that graveyard, you'll find a little marker with a number on it. And if you go to the office and look up that number, you'll find the name Glenn Eric Smith. Glenn Eric Smith is my name, and it was also the name of my half-brother who died at childbirth. And my parents were not, my adopted parents, were not able to have any more children. And so they came looking for me, and I was in an orphanage in Quebec, Canada. They knew about this doctor who worked with unwed mothers in Quebec and found that he would find Christian homes for these illegitimate babies, and he would contact people that he knew who were Christians that needed to adopt, and that's where they came to get me. I was taken back to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where I lived for about 6 or 7 years, and I was the object of much adoration because I was the oldest of any of the grandchildren. None of my other aunts and uncles had children of their own, so I was spoiled rotten. And it was a wonderful experience. My parents were devout Christians from a very conservative branch of Protestantism. My dad was rather distant. That's who he was. My mom adored me. I was the apple of her eye, mainly probably because she could not have any children. And I had the best of everything that I could possibly want. They were strict in the sense that there was a lot of discipline in the house. I didn't get away with much. And one of the first times I remember the subject of adoption coming up was in my 4th grade class. We had a citizenship class for a week, I think, a special class. And because I was from Canada, I had immigrated to the United States, and I became a naturalized citizen when I was 4 years old. And there were all kinds of clippings and newspaper articles about it, and I brought these to school, and they were part of a big collage on a bulletin board. And I'm not sure at that point if I really realized what adoption was, but it was there for anybody to see. My 4th grade friends never said anything at all. It wasn't until I went to middle school at a very prestigious private school, and my best friend was adopted there, that I really realized how derogatory it was to be adopted. For some reason, my schoolmates found out about my best friend's adoption and followed him around using the word bastard as many times as they possibly could. And I was in dread of ever finding out that I was adopted too. And that was the first time I remembered thinking, this is a really bad thing. And so I kept it a secret. I kept it a secret from everybody that I could and never mentioned it to anybody. One of the things, I guess I kind of thought about it, maybe in my subconscious or not, because I would remember listening to my parents talking about me late at night. I would sneak out and listen to them talking in the kitchen, and I always came away with the idea that perhaps I would be given back to wherever I had come from. My dad would say things like, I don't know what to do with him, I don't know how he thinks, I don't know what we're going to do, but we're going to have to do something. And in my mind, that meant, okay, I'm going to go back to wherever I came from, and I don't know where that is. So that was always a clue, and I would every once in a while I would ask and say, "Do you know where I came from?" And they would say, "Well, aren't we good enough?" Or haven't we treated you well enough? You don't need to ask those kinds of questions. That's not appropriate for you to ask. And so after a while I didn't say anything. And it wasn't until I was in my probably late 20s that my mother ever brought up the subject again. And it was, she handed me a sheaf of papers that were some of my papers from being born in Quebec, but never gave me any explanation for what they really meant. And so you grow up, one grows up with the idea that although I have a loving family and loving aunts and uncles and cousins by this point, that they all have a background and I don't. I don't know anything about where I am. I don't know who my parents really were, what they did. Absolutely, it was a brick wall that I couldn't get past. One of the things that adoptees and I did was wonder why I was put up for adoption. Yes, we hear all about, well, we put you up for adoption because we couldn't take care of you the right way. But basically what we as adoptees wonder is, was there something wrong with us? Was there something, were we bad? Were we maybe deformed in some way, maybe some medical issue that we don't know anything about? But there had to be some reason why a mother would give up a child, and it probably had to do with the fact that the child was defective in some way. I'm a counselor and I see adoptees in my office, and this is a question that comes up all the time. Growing up, nobody would talk about adoption, at least to me. Nobody would give me a hint. They just kind of ignored the whole subject. And so I went around wondering, and of course you wonder, especially at times like your birthday, like what if I have a mother, what is she doing? What is she thinking about? Why doesn't she come looking for me? Obviously I was in no shape to look for my mother at that point, but you would think that somehow the attachment would be so great that she would have to come looking, or my father.
I noticed that on some holidays that Glenn would get very pensive, and I couldn't figure it out, and especially on his birthday, we make everybody pretty special in our family when their birthday comes, and he just sort of had this cloud over him, and one day I just said, is everything okay? Why don't, he's like, yeah, everything's fine. He said, I just can't help but think about my mom today. If she's still alive somewhere and this day comes, she has to be thinking about me, and I don't think maybe she's alive. Nobody's ever said she's looking for me. So it would be like a big question. It was a closed door, and sometimes on other holidays too. And you get to the point where you realize that you can do a lot of things for somebody, but you can't make up for their mother not being there.
One of the things that came home to me one day was I had come home from school. I was probably 11 or 12 and going about my normal business, and my sister came in, who was 5 years younger, and she started to tell me about this schoolmate of hers who was the worst person in the world, who was terrible. She was ugly, she was dumb, and she was adopted. And I kind of froze, and I said, not even thinking, what do you think you are? And she said, I am not. I said, yes, you are. And she went screaming off to my mother, and that's how she found out. I don't know why my parents didn't tell her or why she didn't know, but it just drove home again the fact that we were different and we were never going to be the same as other children were. Jackie and I got married very early. We were in our 20s, and one of the things that I always thought about was, should we adopt? Should I carry this over to another generation? And I couldn't do it. I wanted my own family. Here we go. That was my blood relatives. Even though I knew that it would really be a good thing to adopt other children, I couldn't do it.
I remember you saying, these are the only 4 people on the earth that I know of that are related to me.
Yeah.
Our 4 children.
And so after the kids came along, I thought about looking. The internet was in its infancy, and there are plenty of what would you call them? Internet places that you can go to look for adoptees or adoptive parents. You register online, and there's huge data banks. And I did that for a number of years, and nobody ever answered.
And we also we contacted. We got the name of the doctor that placed you with your parents, and
right. We called
them, and they said there had been they weren't any help, but they said there was a fire in the church, then all the birth certificates got burnt, and then there was like just roadblocks. We went up to Quebec and looked at all the birth records in 2012, came back empty.
Yeah, Quebec will not release any adoptive records. It's the only province right now that won't do it still.
And Glenn would say, I guess we're not supposed to find out. Nothing is working out.
In 1981, my adoptive mother passed away, and without letting me know anything about the adoption. And in 2014, my dad passed away without letting me know anything. And I figured at this point I would be free to look, so we started to look in earnest. We went on Ancestry.com and a site called 23andMe, which are huge databases of DNA. And my daughter Penny actually started it because one of her children wanted to know, had a program at school where they were to give their family trees. They were to work on their family trees. And my granddaughter said to her, why doesn't Grandpa have a family tree? And so my daughter said, well, we're going to find it. And so she started to work with these 2 companies, and we went down every rabbit trail you could think of. There were people coming out of the woodwork saying, oh, I know where your dad comes from. He comes from X. And so we would pursue that, and it didn't happen. Or your dad was connected to the church that he attended in Pittsburgh, and there was somebody in Detroit, and we went down that rabbit trail, and that didn't work either. But little by little, my daughter was compiling a huge DNA family tree that was getting closer and closer. In fact, she had a correspondence going with the Orphans Court in Pittsburgh with a particular young woman who was working there. And the young woman said, well, I can't tell you her name, but I can tell you what her name is not. And so my daughter would be checking all these leads and would call her up at least once a week and say, just like kind of like Rumpelstiltskin, is it this? And the lady would say, no, it's not that. Is it this? No, it's not that name. And she said, but I'll tell you when you hit the right one, but I won't tell you that it is the right one. And so one day, through all kinds of rabbit trails, finally my daughter called and said, is it Colleen? And the woman kind of gasped and said, not really. And my daughter checked all of her family trees again and called back and said, is it Corrine? And my mother's name is Corrine Williams, or Corrine MacKay. That was her maiden name. And the lady in Pittsburgh says, I can't tell you you're right. And we knew right then that was my mother's name. So we found out where Corrine Williams lived, a little place in Ontario called Tillsonburg. And we also found out that she had 4 daughters. And Penny called, that's my daughter.
So we had got the word that Penny had found who Corrine Williams was, and that meant from the time we signed up on Ancestry on 2014, this was September 3rd, 2015, when we got the call from Penny that night. And she said, I'm going to call them and talk to them, Dad. And she said, now I'll call you back and make sure it's the right one. So she did call, and she said, okay, you have a sister named Judy. I talked to her, and your mother lives with her right now, and she wants you to call and talk to her tomorrow. So I wasn't home, but I heard about it.
When Penny called, she was over the moon with emotion, and we were pretty well shaken. We sat there and shivered, and I think we prayed that this was the right thing to do and this is the right step to take. And after all those years and all the mistakes and all of the false leads, that this would be the right one. We hoped that this would be it. And so the next day I called my sister, who is now my sister, Judy, and she was welcoming. She said, I am so glad you called. This is the most exciting thing that's happened to us. We always wanted a brother, and we never knew that we had one. And she said, I've called my other sisters, and they are in. What we found out was she called my oldest sister, and my oldest sister said, don't do it. Don't call back. This can't be true. And then my older sister called Judy back and said, no, I think we have to do this. We have to pursue it and see if this is really.
She said, what if that was us looking for Mom, and we were that close and nobody would open the door for us to. So she called Judy and said, I think we need to do it. And it was such a shock to them to find out that this was such a secret all those years, that they had no inkling that their mom had this experience. She had never told anybody but one older sister, and they were just like, they couldn't believe it. And Glenn was so afraid that something would happen to her when they asked her about it. He was afraid that she might have a heart attack or a stroke.
She was ill. She had lung cancer, and she had all kinds of issues, health issues. And I was afraid that, at long last, if I finally contact her and I cause her death, that would be like the ultimate guilt for an adopted child.
It was a pretty amazing set of circumstances that Penny, that opened up for Penny as she was on this, the final steps of the search. When she found out the name was Corrine Williams, she tracked her down on the internet and found a phone number of someone who lived out in Western Canada, and so she called that number, and it was Glenn's uncle Carlton, Corrine's brother, and he said, oh no, she's not here, she lives with her daughter in Tillsonburg, and just right off gave Penny the number. And so Penny called us and said that night, Dad, I have a phone number here. It's supposed to go to your mother. Do you want to call or do you want me to call? And Glenn just turned as white as a ghost and he started to shake, and I got pretty shaky too. And we said, we'll call you back. And we called back and said, why don't you call? And so she did, and she said, I'll let you know. Well, about a half an hour went by, and Glenn immediately is thinking, like, maybe something bad happened to his mother. They don't want to ever talk to us again. He was just like, so couldn't figure out why we didn't hear. But the reason was, when Penny called, in this part of the story we love to tell, she called his sister Judy, and she said, my name is Penny Clark. I'm from Montana. I'm looking for some information on in our family, and I think that your family tree is my family tree, and there's some things we can share. And so Judy said, oh, I'm into ancestry too. I'm really into that. Well, whose names do you have? So they chatted a little bit, and Penny said, okay, so what I really want to ask you is, this is sort of a hard question, but do you think that your mom could have had a child before she married to your dad? She said, because I think your mother and my dad's mother are the same person. And Judy was just dumbfounded. She said, you just don't know our mother. You don't know. That just couldn't be. But she said, this is the wonderful part. She said, we'll check and we'll call you back. And that's when Penny left it with us, that they were going to call back. Well, the whole next day and the next day and the next day, it was 9 days. It seemed like forever. By this time, Glenn was sure that they had changed their phone numbers. He probably, put a restraining order on any of us to ever contact them again. But no, then she called, and that's when Glenn got to actually talk to her on the telephone that day. And we still, every time we write a card to Judy or we talk to her, we just say, Judy, we're so thankful you answered the phone and took that big step, because what it did was it made them, Judy and Diane, at least maybe some of the other family members, but it made them have to ask their mother a really tough question. And once they did, she told them the story of how she had been engaged, I think, to a young man, and it was looking good. She moved away from home. She was working in Quebec, and it didn't go well, and meanwhile she had a baby on the way, and she stayed there until Glenn was born, and then she went straight back to work in Ontario.
Well, and the person she was engaged to abandoned her and said, when my mother found out she was pregnant, the person, my father, abandoned her and said he couldn't marry her, his family wouldn't permit it, and so she had to bear the pregnancy and afterwards by herself, and she was very poor. And she told me, or she told my daughter, that there was no way that she could actually afford to keep me, and she couldn't take me back to her family because they wouldn't understand. This is 1948, and that was disgraceful at that point. But she was just horrified at the fact that she would have to leave this baby. So, Judy, when I got on the phone with Judy and she told me what a wonderful thing this was, she said, the next thing she said was, would you like to talk to your mother? I didn't know what to do. I was 67 years old. I had been looking for probably all my conscious life, in a sense, and here I was on the other end of the phone with an older woman who was my mother. And so I said, yes, I would. And she got on the phone and she said to me, I have been praying for you every day of your life. And it was hard, not hard to believe, but it was such a shock. First of all, that she actually cared about me, and second of all, that she was a Christian, and that prayer was important to her as it was to me. And I found out later that all of my family are Christians, and share the same foundations that I share, which is just a miracle to me.
So it was arranged that we were going to, would be okay if we could send some pictures. And so we very quickly put together a little album that covered most of Glenn's life, from his childhood, teens, graduation from college and everything, into a little album, and wrote a letter to his mom, wrote a letter to Judy, put it in the mail. And it's going to take like longer than in the United States to get it up to Canada, so we're waiting to hear back if they got it. And it was about 2 weeks later we got a letter back from them that they had gotten it, and they had sent a whole batch of pictures of his mom, updated pictures that we hadn't had. That was like our first to have a picture of her, and we just kept walking around the house with this picture. We couldn't believe it. We were like staring at it, and put it on the fridge, put it on our dresser. It was just like so amazing to realize. And we wrote a letter back, and one thing I remember that Glenn wrote a card to his mother, and he wrote "Dear Mother" on it in his handwriting, and it was like a big moment that day. And he's not one to do a lot of cards for people left and right. He could not get that card in the mail fast enough. He was like, "This is going to my mom." So the mailman took it, and then after that we made arrangements to go up for a visit, which was in November.
What was going on in your mind during what she was mentioning?
Oh, it was just this fantastic relief, this closure of something that had been eating at me all my adult life, and I couldn't wait to see what they all looked like, or what they all talked like, or what they were like. But in the back of my mind, like most adoptees, we worry that even if we do meet our parents or relatives, will they accept us? Because the initial rejection was there, for no bad reason at all, but we live with rejection, so we think, oh, maybe they won't like me, or maybe they won't like the way I look, or I won't fit in somehow. My daughter Penny, who had done all the leg work, flew in from Montana, and we drove up through Niagara Falls to Tillsonburg. Well, we actually didn't go quite to Tillsonburg. We were too afraid to go that one day, so we stayed in a motel overnight, trying to get our courage up for the next day. And the next day we got up and we got on the way to Tillsonburg to find out that we got to my oldest sister's house to find out that my mother had a fall in the bathroom and was in the hospital, but she was going to be okay. So we took another trip to the hospital, and I walked into her hospital room, and I'm not sure which one of us was more emotionally moved than the other one. She just looked and looked and looked and looked at me, as if she couldn't take it in. Of course, and I was drinking in everything I could about her. What does she look like? What's her facial structure like? What's her voice sound like? What's everything about her? And so that was my first time seeing her. She came home the next day, or that day? Next day. And so we were all in the same house together, and all my sisters came over, and their husbands, and
they all just kept saying, his name was MacKay,
Yeah, well-
and his birth name was MacKay.
Check, the
Oh.
phone camera's not on yet.
Oh, sorry. I thought they were. I didn't see that. I was looking at you.
Go ahead.
So when all the family was there, we kept passing pictures around. The album I had sent up to my mother went around a number of times, and my brothers-in-law kept saying, you know, we thought this was all, you know, somebody putting something on, taking advantage of an old lady. But when he walked into the room, he said he looked like a MacKay, he walked like a MacKay, he waves his hands like a MacKay. There is no doubt whatsoever that this is a MacKay. And it was the first time I had ever had or been in a group of people that had shared the characteristics that I did, that I didn't know where they came from.
So on our way from the motel over to their house, we stopped and we were about 10 minutes away to just call and make sure that it was still all right. And that's when we found out that his mom had been taken to the hospital. But our brother-in-law, Al, was home, and Alan said, you just come right along anyway. So we did. And he was very gracious and welcoming. And he just sort of couldn't stop staring at Glenn and not interrupting, but interjecting, like in our conversation about how much he looked like the family. It just came up like about 6 times. I remember making a note of it. It's like he just was fascinated with how much this person that just walked in, a stranger, is now looking so much like their family. So Diane came home, his sister Diane came home from the hospital first, and I remember she opened the door from the garage. We were in the downstairs family room, and she just stopped and looked at Glenn with a big smile on her face, and she just came over and hugged him like her long lost brother that he was. And they just made us feel not like special, not that way. They made us feel like family. And we kept saying, this is just like family. But it is family. That must have been said about 10 times that weekend. They were so at ease with us and so thankful, just huge thankful that we had made the connection and that they now had a brother.
So my mother so we came home from that trip, and about 2 weeks later, we received word that she was not doing well. And so we drove up and stayed with her at the hospital for a day, for just about a day. She was going downhill rapidly. She wasn't responding very well to anybody.
We just sat with the family.
So we just sat and watched and waited. And we finally went home, and Thanksgiving, that'd be our Thanksgiving, she passed away. And we made another trip up for the funeral. And that was traumatic to say the least, because she had told, she had told the girls not to tell anybody about me until she was gone. And I think the old traditions still held from 1948 that you did not talk about things like that. And so when she passed away, my sisters immediately started to call their children and others to let them know.
Diane said
news.
she called her son and she was crying, and she said, Grandma's gone, but wait, I have good news. And they're like, what is this? What good news
What could you possibly have? And you have an uncle. And it was a shock that went through the family. So we went to the funeral and sat in the front row with the family, which was a unique experience. And my nephew gave the eulogy, and he gave a pretty standard eulogy about what my mother had done and all the children and the grandchildren. And then he came to a point in his eulogy, and I'm going to have to read it, and I'm not sure I'm going to make it through. My nephew Christian paused in the middle of his eulogy and he said, "Despite all the stories we had heard from Grandma, there was an important story that we did not. As it turns out, this story that many of us only learned after we received the news of Grandma's passing was to become a beautiful story of redemption and reconciliation. Although many details of this story are unknown to us, a very important detail is known. Just prior to Grandma coming to Ontario, she had a wonderful son." You're going to have to cut it. I can't do this. I've never been able to do this without. Through this knowledge, I learned a more complete and beautiful experience of my grandma that I already thought complete. For all her strength, I learned of her vulnerability. Being that at the time of Glenn's birth in 1948 in Quebec, Grandma, a very young and scared woman at the time, could not care for this son, as I suspect she would have loved to. And Glenn was to be taken into adoption by a wonderful Christian family. And what began as a tragic story in 1948, as an innocent child was born, became a story of redemption and reconciliation. Glenn took on the challenge of finding his birth mother, and in the last months of her life, my grandma could be redeemed and reconciled to the son she had lost some 66 years ago. A son reunited to his mother, a mother reunited to her son. I later learned at the time of their reunion the depth of love my grandma had, but could not express for her son. Although Glenn could not be in her life, he was always in her prayers. Grandma was at last able to tell the son that she loved, that he had been the subject of her prayers every night. When I consider this beautiful story that was never told, the lack of detail and an auspicious beginning, I am reminded of the words of the Apostle Paul in Romans 8:28, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him. At that point in the funeral, I, who had held everything together really well,
Didn't.
Right. And everybody on our bench, from my cousins beside me, to my wife, to my daughter, we were all visibly moved, shall I say. And when it was time for us to get up, of course they took the front row first to exit the church. When I stood up, it was like the gaze of 300 people on me, seeing a person that they had never known about ever, because my mother had never told anyone. After the funeral, we really had a very interesting time meeting all the people that never knew anything about me. And after we came home, at Christmas time, a package arrived in the mail, and it was a tie with the MacKay tartan, and it was a pin that was my mother's for my wife that she had worn whenever she went out. And what else was there?
There was like a coat of arms for you, like a lapel pin type thing,
And
but it was the official MacKay tartan.
Yeah,
that
it was the first time I had ever really felt that I belonged somewhere.
And he wore the tie, and he said, I'm going to wear this, and I hope people comment on my tie so I can tell them where it came from.
Yeah.
And he did.
And we've since gotten together a number of times, and mostly what we do is talk and
Laugh.
And eat. Yes, we're all good eaters, and so we're looking forward again this summer to getting together with everyone.
And when Glenn was sick this past winter in the hospital, they were on the phone and emailed, and the first morning he was home, 8 o'clock in the morning, the florist is at the front door with a big bouquet, a beautiful arrangement from the Canada family. And they're just connected, and every time they call, they say two things. How much they love Glenn, and have you told anybody our story lately? Have you told anybody our story? And they don't wait for Glenn says, if somebody asks, I'll tell them. And we don't wait for people to ask. We just tell them. It's just such a wonderful story, and we think it is too.